Evolutionary Science and the Catholic Church by Reverend Mr. Kevin W. Vogel. Read by Father Kevin W. Vogel. Evolutionary Science and the Catholic Church, Chapter 3. Evolution in the Doctrinal Documents of the Church. Many people ask about evolution and the Church in terms of what the Church's official position on evolution is. This question actually comes from a false understanding of the Church. The main work of the Church is not scientific discovery. So when it comes to evolution as a scientific theory, the Church has no official position. Instead, the Church supports the freedom of scientists to strive to understand the physical world. The Church's work is proclaiming the gospel of Jesus Christ, calling people to repentance and conversion from sin, and offering a personal relationship with each of the persons of the Trinity. In short, the Church is concerned with the salvation of souls. Why then is the Church interested in evolution? The Church is involved in numerous ways. We see Catholic theologians, philosophers, and scientists entering into heated debates about evolution and religion. One can find allusions to evolution in magisterial and papal writings. There is a pontifical academy dedicated to science. In 2009, on the anniversary of the publication of The Origin of the Species, the 3STOQ International Conference was held that was partially sponsored by the Gregorian University and Pontifical Council for Culture. If the Church claims no competence in science, what can it say with regard to evolution? The Church understands herself as instituted by Christ to be his visible body through which he reveals the truth about himself, man, and man's salvation to the world. The Church is centered around proclaiming the truth, not only about God, but also about the world and ourselves. Science, as described earlier, is a way of knowing, a way of using our reason to come to some truths about the world and ourselves. As a source of truth, the Church is interested in the findings of science, in particular, what science says about ourselves. Since all truth has its origin in God, revealed truth can never be contrary to truth discovered through science. Truth cannot contradict truth. Footnote 94. The facts upon which evolution is based tell us something about ourselves and our world. Pope John Paul II noted that, quote, the Church's magisterium, the Pope in union with the bishops, is directly concerned with the question of evolution, for it involves the conception of the human person, end quote. Footnote 95. It is due to the way evolution impacts our understanding of ourselves that the Church is interested in what it says. 4 areas concerning evolution. There are 4 major areas that the Church's magisterium has addressed concerning the theory of evolution. It is important to note that none of these areas are concerned with the truth of scientific findings. This reflects what was said above about the Church's competence not being in the methods of science. Instead of critiquing the science of evolution, the Church understands its competence in addressing philosophical and theological claims that are made based on evolution. The truth or falsity of these extra-scientific interpretations of the scientific theory of evolution has no bearing on the truth or falsity of the scientific theory itself. Thus, the Church says nothing about the truth or falsity of the scientific theory of evolution itself. First, the Church defends the reality of philosophical and theological truths. Philosophy and theology are legitimate ways of knowing. This is to counter claims by some intellectuals that science is the only legitimate way of knowing. This view reduces everything that can be known to only that which is material and can be discovered through experimentation. It is then further claimed that matter is the only thing that exists. Materialism. Second, the Church's teaching that God divinely orders the world through secondary causes is compatible with scientifically random processes. There is no opposition between a process science would understand as random and the necessary involvement of God in this process from the point of view of theology. This counters the false claim that our world is fully explained by random processes, thereby proving that God does not exist. Third, the Church understands the human person as distinctly different from all other creatures. No other creature is a union of body and spiritual soul as man is. This counters the false claim that humans are merely products of a natural process, that leads directly from non-human creatures to human creatures. This false view denies the existence of man's spiritual soul, placing humans in the same category of being with all other animals. Fourth, the Church defends its teaching on original sin. Man, as he was originally created, did not experience the distortions of his nature that he now faces as a consequence of his turning away from the will of God. This counters the false claim that man emerged naturally from creatures already in a state of distortion, sin, and death. Philosophical and theological truth. The Church recognizes all three areas of science, philosophy, and theology as legitimate ways of gaining knowledge. In 1950, Pius XII recognized in his encyclical Humani Generis that evolution was a scientific hypothesis that could be tested to determine its truth. Footnote 96. In 1996, John Paul II referred back to this document, now calling evolution, quote, more than a hypothesis, end quote. In other words, a theory, because further scientific findings have shown that the framework of evolution describes its body of knowledge well. Footnote 97. Here the Church is accepting science as a legitimate way of knowing. Without mentioning evolution by name, the Catechism acknowledges that scientific research like that of evolution has enriched our understanding of the age and dimensions of the universe. Footnote 98. The International Theological Commission's 2004 document, Communion and Stewardship, explicitly states that there is evidence to support some kind of evolution, but that controversy within the scientific community remains as to exactly how it takes place. Footnote 99. John Paul II clarified further that the acceptance of evolution is conditional. Footnote 100. It should not be accepted as more certain than the methods of science can make it, nor can it be used to make claims about the world that are beyond its methodological limitations. It is precisely in response to science making claims beyond its methods that Pius XII addressed evolution in Humani Generis. He was concerned about false opinions that were threatening to undermine Catholic doctrine. A number of these false philosophies used evolution as justification for their erroneous beliefs. Such false philosophies included pantheism, materialism, communism, existentialism, a denial of the essences of things, some forms of historicism that deny absolute truth, immanentism, idealism, and atheism. Footnote 101. The Catechism also mentions such possible erroneous philosophical responses to the question of our origins. Footnote 102. John Paul II warned against combinations of evolution and philosophy that, quote, regard the spirit either as emerging from the forces of living matter or as a simple epiphenomenon of that matter, end quote. A view sometimes called emergentism. Footnote 103. Evolution continues to be used as justification for erroneous philosophies such as New Age spirituality and atheism. Footnote 104. Neither Pius XII nor later documents condemn evolution as a science, but rather using it beyond its limitations to make philosophical and theological claims. Science, and therefore evolution, can only give partial information about man. The knowledge we receive through divine revelation, quote, transcends, unifies, and gives meaning, end quote, to what we learn from evolution. Footnote 105. This is a major theme in Benedict XVI's writings. While affirming that there is great scientific evidence to support evolution, he notes that the theory cannot answer every question, especially ones like, where does everything come from? Part of what we can reason is obtained by the scientific method, but reason is broader than science. Footnote 106. Quote, the theory of evolution sees the truth, but sees only half the truth. It does not see that behind it is the spirit of the creation. We are fighting to expand reason. End quote. Footnote 107. If science is held as the only valid source of knowledge, then human reason itself is diminished. Human reason is reduced to only being capable of knowing what is material. Benedict XVI thus defends the true nature of human reason. In his address to the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, PAS, in 2006, he upheld that there are questions that can only be answered by philosophy and through divine revelation. so cannot be replaced by scientific answers alone. To do so would have grave consequences. First, it could not fulfill all man's needs, some of which are spiritual. Secondly, it would deny man's transcendence and freedom, thus making him less than what he is as man. Footnote 108. Reducing what human reason is capable of reduces who man is. Benedict not only reiterated this point in his 2006 conference, Creation and Evolution, with a number of his former students, but also went further to say that, quote, the theory of evolution implies questions that must be assigned to philosophy, end quote. Footnote 109. In fact, as John Paul II noted in his 1992 address to the PAS, all science assumes and shows that the world is intelligible. Theology interprets this intelligibility as having its source in divine reason. Footnote 110. Part of the reason that science was taken up as the only way of knowing was that it seemed to give contradictory results from that of theology. Instead of solving the apparent opposition by the denial of theological truth, the response should be a proper unity. According to John Paul II, such a unity should be based on a critical openness and dynamic interchange that recognizes the competences and limitations of both science and theology. This does not mean methodological boundaries should be broken, for then the separate ways of knowing would cease to function correctly. Both science and theology, quote, must preserve their autonomy and their distinctiveness, end quote, each possessing, quote, its own pattern of procedures, its diversities of interpretation, and its own conclusions, end quote. Quote, the unity that we seek, as we have already stressed, is not identity. The Church does not propose that science should become religion or religion science. On the contrary, unity always presupposes the diversity and the integrity of its elements. Each of these members should become not less itself, but more itself, in a dynamic interchange, for a unity in which one of the elements is reduced to the other is destructive, false in its promises of harmony, and ruinous in the integrity of its components. We are asked to become one. We are not asked to become each other. End quote. Footnote 111. It is not a question of either science or theology, but both science and theology. John Paul II also proposed that, quote, often beyond two partial and contrasting perceptions, there exists a wider perception that includes them and goes beyond them both. End quote. Footnote 112. Philosophy specifically takes that role as a wider perception that can help connect science and theology. With regard to evolution, there is a Christian responsibility to unify modern scientific thought and our theology of creation. Quote, Christians have the responsibility to locate the modern scientific understanding of the universe within the context of the theology of creation. End quote. Footnote 113. In his 2008 address to the PAS, Benedict XVI notes one specific area of philosophy that must be properly addressed, that of metaphysics. It must be upheld that, quote, in order to develop and evolve, the world must first be, and thus have come from nothing into being. It must be created, in other words, by the first being, who is such by essence. End quote. Footnote 114. Divine ordering and random processes. As explained in Chapter 2, the science of evolution sees random processes as playing a large part in the development of different forms of life. This has been interpreted by some to indicate the origin of the world, and ultimately our own origin is solely a product of blind chance. They conclude there is no indication of God in this process, so no need for his existence. We must recognize that these assertions are not scientific conclusions, but philosophical ones. Thus, they need to be critiqued not on the science, but through philosophical reasoning. The Catechism recognizes this question about our origins. Quote, is the universe governed by chance, blind fate, anonymous necessity, or by a transcendent, intelligent, and good being called God? End quote. Footnote 115. Benedict XVI, from his installation homily onward, has constantly reminded us that the only answer to this question is that, quote, we are not some casual and meaningless product of evolution. Each of us is the result of a thought of God, end quote. Footnote 116. There are two options for the origin of the universe. It either began with reason or unreason. If the world began in unreason, then we are simply, quote, chance results of evolution, merely products of a blind evolution, failed products of evolution, the result of mere chance or evolutionary determinism. Footnotes 117 through 120. Reason cannot result from unreason. Meaning cannot be derived from meaninglessness. So what we perceive as reasonable would at its core be meaningless. This loss of meaning then leads to numerous problems as we lose our understanding of ourselves and our world. Men and women can be used and abused. Man's imperfections will be seen as intrinsic to his being, and our sense of responsibility to use the earth's resources prudently will be diminished. Footnotes 121 through 123. As mentioned earlier, science both assumes and shows that the world is intelligible. Footnote 124. Though there is much about the physical world that is irrational and chaotic, it is itself capable of being understood through our reason. It is itself rational. Thus it can be asked where this rationality originates. This question ultimately cannot be answered by science directly, but only through faith. Quote, it is not the laws of matter which ultimately govern the world and mankind, but a personal God governs the universe. It is not the laws of matter and of evolution that have the final say, but reason, will, love, a person. Life is not a simple product of laws and the randomness of matter. End quote. Footnote 125. One must interpret evolution from the understanding that a personal rational God is behind everything that exists. In a general audience concerning proofs for the existence of God, John Paul II recognized evolution as being directed by its internal mechanisms in a certain direction, an ordering that brings one back to the question of a creator. Footnote 126. This is a philosophical and theological interpretation of scientific data, not a scientific conclusion. Benedict XVI has also described evolution as an order with which God created the world. Our call to subdue the earth is an active collaboration in God's work of ordering that science describes as evolution. Footnote 127. This follows the Catholic idea of continuing creation. As the Catechism describes, creation was not complete from the beginning. Instead, God continues to guide his creation toward its perfection through his divine providence. Footnote 128. Evolution supports the fact that creation is not complete, and since as a science it does not address the issue of God, evolution cannot deny the presence of his divine providence in guiding creation. Communion and Stewardship notes that evolution touches two central ideas in the Catholic theology of creation: creation from nothing and creation of man. Footnote 129. The creation of man will be discussed in the next section, but the two ideas are essentially connected. The creation of human persons after God's own image follows God's creation from nothing, ex nihilo. Persons who can act freely must have their source in a personal God who himself acts freely. One cannot speak of God as a force or energy at the origin of the universe. Rather, quote, creation ex nihilo is the act of a transcendent personal agent, acting freely and intentionally, with a view toward the all-encompassing purposes of personal engagement. End quote. Footnote 130. The act of creating out of nothing is our first indication of God acting freely as a person, and ordering what he brings into existence toward the creation of personal beings. Footnote 131. God works through natural causes to bring about the conditions for life. He also works to bring about their continual sustainment. When evolutionary scientists explore the mechanisms of evolution, natural selection, mutations, genetic drift, and gene flow, they bring about the discussion of an event occurring due to unforeseen causes. A single event may be radically contingent on many causes that cannot be predicted. Here there seems to be a lack of order, and these scientists conclude there to be no place for divine providential causality. But this contingency is not incompatible with the way God interacts with the world. Just because the causes are unforeseen by us does not mean that it is not guided, not seen by God. Due to the limitations of the methods of science remaining only in the physical realm, the scientists cannot but conclude that processes of evolution are absolutely unguided. It is a matter of faith that we know God's actions extend to everything that exists. So an unguided evolutionary process, one that is not subject to divine providence, is not possible. Footnote 132. Uniqueness of human nature. Because science is limited to the material realm, it can only make observations directly about the material part of man. In 1950, Pius XII allowed evolution to be discussed with regard to human beings, quote, insofar as it inquires into the origin of the human body from already existing in living matter, end quote. Footnote 133. He allowed for the possibility that the matter of the human body could have connections with previous life forms. In a 1986 general audience, John Paul II reiterated Pius XII's allowance for the human body to have been prepared in the forms of prior living beings. John Paul II agreed that there is a link between man and the rest of nature. But one could not use evolution to claim that man was entirely derived from higher animals. Footnote 134. Both popes upheld that, quote, the Catholic faith obliges us to hold that souls are immediately created by God, end quote, so could not have emerged from matter. Footnote 135. John Paul II repeated this conditional acceptability of evolution in his 1996 address to the PAS. Footnote 136. In 2004, Communion and Stewardship explained that the immediate creation of each human soul by God is a basis for divine intimacy with each of us. Footnote 137. The creation of the human soul, like the creation of the world ex nihilo, is a personal act of God, bringing something into being that did not exist before. Quote, the emergence of the first members of the human species, whether as individuals or in populations, represents an event that is not susceptible of a purely natural explanation and which can appropriately be attributed to divine intervention. End quote. Footnote 138. The creation of the soul is rightly called a divine intervention into God's created order. Some claim that such interventions would do damage to the natural order of the world. This is a misunderstanding of the way God's providence acts, both to bring into existence the natural order and keep it in existence. These interventions are non-disruptive with regard to the natural order because it is God's providence behind both. God does not subvert natural laws, but acts in a way that transcends what created causes can bring about. Science can study the physical chains of causes, but it cannot determine the points at which God chooses to act in non-disruptive personal ways within the framework of natural causes. John Paul II notes the complementarity of evolution and theology. Evolution tells us we are part of the natural world of changeable becoming, but theology tells us that our difference from the rest of nature is much greater than what we have in common. Footnote 139. Quote, the human person is God's image and cannot be reduced to a mere portion of nature. End quote. Footnote 140. In his 1996 address to the PAS, John Paul II spoke of this difference as an, quote, ontological discontinuity, end quote, between animals and man. He notes that while science cannot observe this ontological transition, since it cannot observe the non-physical soul, it can observe physical signs that indicate that a creature is a human being. Such physical signs are linked to the spiritual realities, such as self-reflection, moral conscience, and religious experience. He calls for further reflection on whether this discontinuity is contrary to the continuity of evolution. It is here he feels that the understanding of the methods of science and theology and the use of philosophy can aid in coming to an understanding that they are reconcilable. Footnote 141. Reflecting on this discontinuity, Communion and Stewardship notes that the very nature of evolution is changed by the entrance of man into the world. Footnote 142. What evolution is for humans has to fundamentally change, since they are no longer simply material beings. Any kind of evolution of man would have to take into account man's physical and spiritual nature, so could not be fully described by science alone. Benedict XVI has also applied the language of evolution to describe the further transition from sinful to redeemed man. Christ's resurrection could be considered the greatest mutation in this new human evolution that takes into account man's corporeality and spirituality. It is the most important change, quote, absolutely the most critical leap into a totally new dimension that there has ever been in the long history of life and its development, end quote. The evolution of man is not simply a biological development that can be studied by science, but rather it involves the whole person, body and soul. Here Benedict XVI is not doing evolutionary science, but is reinterpreting the meaning of evolution to explain theological truths about man. Footnote 143. 2 years after speaking of the ontological discontinuity between animals and man, John Paul II again addressed the PAS, this time defending the concept of human nature. This was in response to the temptation of reducing man to a physical reality. Footnote 144. If man is nothing more than continually evolving living matter, then, some argue, there is no enduring nature that exists. Citing Fides et Ratio, John Paul II points out that nature is the proper object of study for philosophy. The philosophical understanding of the natures of things is quite important. The concept is used to speak not just about man's nature as spiritual and corporeal, but also to speak about the reality and essence of God's divine nature, to explain creation and its existence in relation to God, to elucidate the meaning of history as things by their nature are directed back to God, to describe the incarnation of Jesus as one person in two natures, and to explain the unity and solidarity of man in one nature. Footnote 145. Polygenism and original sin. Finally, the Church defends its teaching on original sin, which it upholds as being divinely revealed. Footnote 146. Man, as he was originally created, did not experience the distortions of his nature that he now faces as a consequence of his turning away from the will of God. The Council of Orange in 529 A.D. rejects the notion that, quote, the first man was made mortal in the sense that he was to die a bodily death whether he sinned or not, end quote. Death cannot be understood as a, quote, necessity of nature, end quote. Footnote 147. In Humana Generis, Pius XII addressed the question of polygenism as it relates to original sin. Some scientists had speculated about the origin of man as coming from multiple ancestors. They claimed that the human species likely developed from more than one ancestor in more than one place. This seemed to be contrary to the understanding that the human race grew out of one common ancestor, Adam, from which every human being inherited original sin. Pius XII said that, quote, it is not at all apparent how such a view, polygenism, can be reconciled with data which the sources of revealed truth and the documents of the Church propose concerning original sin, end quote. Footnote 148. Such documents include the Council of Trent's decree on original sin, which states that the, quote, sin of Adam is one in origin and is transmitted by propagation, not imitation, end quote. Footnote 149. Sin begins through the personal act of Adam and is transmitted to all humans by generation. The Catechism recognizes that, quote, the account of the fall affirms a primeval event, a deed that took place at the beginning of the history of man. Revelation gives us the certainty of faith that the whole of human history is marked by the original fault freely committed by our first parents, end quote. Footnote 150. So it seems that there cannot be humans that do not have Adam as an ancestor, nor can Adam be a group of human persons. This fall is really the reverse side of the whole Christian gospel, in such a way that, quote, we cannot tamper with the revelation of original sin without undermining the mystery of Christ, end quote. Footnote 151. It was the apparent opposition between the Church's teaching on original sin and polygenism that led to Pius XII's qualified rejection of polygenism. He carefully words his statement, Nequaquam aperiat quomodo, quote, "It is not at all apparent," end quote, in a way that does not appear to outright condemn polygenism, nor accept it. Footnote 152. In 1966, Paul VI addressed theologians at a symposium on original sin, designed to look at the state of exegetical study in the natural sciences. He rejects theories that deny that the propagation of sin originated in the disobedience of Adam. While these theories assume polygenism, it does not appear that Paul VI condemns polygenism as such, but seems to be consistent with Pius XII. Footnote 153. Communion and Stewardship explains that having common human ancestors is the basis for the unity we have under Christ. Quote, "The common ancestry and natural unity of the human race are the basis for a unity in grace of redeemed human persons under the headship of the new Adam." End quote. Footnote 154. Our natural unity forms a basis for our supernatural unity. Little more has been said by the magisterium concerning polygenism and original sin. It is left more to discussion and speculation by theologians. Benedict XVI did consider evolution and original sin in a general audience in 2008. Here he explained the atheistic understanding of original sin, that is sometimes based on an interpretation of evolution. Quote, "In the evolutionist, atheist version of the world, it is implied that being as such from the beginning bears in itself evil and good. Evil is equally original as good, and human history would develop only the model already present in the world of the preceding evolution. That which we Christians call original sin is in reality only the mixed character of being, a mixture of good and evil. According to this theory, it belonged to the very fabric of being." End quote. The claim of this atheistic understanding of evolution is that what we experience as sin is intrinsic to who we are. There was never a time of original innocence from which man fell. This interpretation of evolution is not only incompatible with the Catholic doctrine of original sin, but also with the doctrine of creation. Created being itself is good. Evil is not intrinsic to who we are, but entered through an abuse of liberty. This created state of innocence is a matter of faith, which cannot be studied by science. Scientific evolution can only study the world in which it is now, fallen creation. Benedict XVI brings up an important point to consider. Quote, "Evil remains mysterious. It has been presented in great images, as does chapter 3 of Genesis, with the vision of 2 trees, of the serpent, of sinful man. A great image that makes us guess, but it cannot explain how much in itself is illogical. We can guess, not explain, nor can we recount it as a fact next to another, because it is a more profound reality. It remains a mystery of darkness, of night." End quote. Evil is not rational, so the use of our reason to understand the mystery of the origin of evil will always leave unanswered questions. Footnote 155. This mystery also encompasses the way in which this first sin is transmitted to us. Footnote 156. An overarching flow can be seen in these 4 areas of discussion about evolution by the Church. The most said in any one area is in the first, on philosophical and theological truths. Statements then decrease to the least in the area on polygenism and original sin. As the Church reaches into deeper, more unknown, and more controversial areas, the amount that is prudently said decreases. This is important to remember as one sees how various theologians address these areas, as will be presented in the next chapters. End of Chapter 3 of Evolutionary Science and the Catholic Church by Reverend Mr. Kevin W. Vogel, read by Father Kevin W. Vogel.